You're listening to the Authorpreneur podcast, episode number 18. Welcome to the Authorpreneur podcast. I'm your host, thriller writer Amelia Hay. On this podcast, I will bring you writing, book marketing, and self-publishing advice so that you can create your dream author business, build your author platform, and be creatively independent. You can find the episode show notes and lots more information on the podcast page at ameliahay.com/podcast. Hello writers, is the middle of your story dragging? Are you halfway through writing your manuscript and are not sure where to go from there? If you said yes to either of these questions, then this episode is for you. So what do you do if the middle of your story is dragging or if you're stuck in a rut? The answer to both of these problems is to include a midpoint scene in your novel. However, before you click away and start writing that scene, there are a few things you need to know. In this episode, I will share the necessary ingredients for a great midpoint scene and 5 tips on how to write the midpoint of a novel. This episode is a part of an ongoing series on story structure. If this is the first episode that you've listened to, or if you're curious about a plot point that comes before the midpoint, then I include a link to the previous episodes in the show notes over on my blog. You can find all the relevant links in the podcast notes in your podcast player. The midpoint needs to appear in the middle of the story at the 50% mark. The reason it must appear in the middle is that the plot point acts as a support system that keeps the second act from dragging. However, you can't just plonk in a midpoint scene at the appropriate point in your story because the first half of the second act should build up to this point. Everything that comes before this moment needs to make sense and be a natural build. However, the midpoint should also set up a chain of actions that will lead the characters to the climactic moment of the novel. The story is a journey and the midpoint is merely the halfway mark. Now that we've defined what a midpoint is, it's time to discuss how to write the midpoint of a novel. As you write the midpoint or even outline your story, there are 5 elements you need to consider. While you don't necessarily need all 5 elements, including a few of them will help you to write a strong and compelling midpoint. Tip number 1, include a reveal that affects the context of the story. Every scene in your story, whether it's a novella, short story, or a full-length novel, needs to move the story forward. The same is true of the midpoint. In the midpoint of your story, you need to reveal something to the reader. Sometimes what your characters know and what your readers know can often be very different. In light of this, your midpoint reveal doesn't have to be new for your story's protagonist. For instance, a midpoint reveal could take something that your reader already knows and shed new light on it. Some authors choose to reveal a twist at this point in the story, such as revealing the protagonist's secret. However, this reveal doesn't have to be significant. It can be subtle. An example of a subtle reveal is revealing the antagonist's plan or even the identity of the antagonist if you've chosen to shroud them with a little mystery. This moment, whether it's subtle or major, cannot randomly occur in the midpoint. Clues need to be left to foreshadow the moment for the reader. Keep in mind, a reveal should share new information that changes how the reader and the protagonist view the world and the story's problem. Tip number 2, the midpoint should create a personal shift for the protagonist. The midpoint should mark that moment in your story where your protagonist changes from reacting to the events that unfold to taking action. As per the previous tip, this moment cannot occur in a vacuum. Something needs to happen to trigger a response like this. The protagonist needs to reach a place personally where he can no longer ignore the antagonist's plan and the consequences of this plan if it were to be a success. I like to have an entire scene dedicated to this moment that's after the midpoint, but I tend to write longer books. The midpoint is a great moment for this to take place. This personal shift should also trigger the protagonist to take intentional steps to defeat the antagonistic force. Tip number 3, it should trigger a change in plans. The midpoint is also the moment where the protagonist needs to reach a realization that he can't keep doing the same thing. He needs to pivot to get better results. While the protagonist was purely reacting before this moment, he needs to realize that success requires a more strategic approach, and thus a careful strategic plan to defeat the antagonist is created. As the protagonist's realization grows, so does his knowledge of the extent of the story problem and what's at stake if he should fail. This realization leads the protagonist to be more open to help from other people to defeat the antagonist. Tip number 4, strip away the protagonist support system. Leading up to the middle of your story, the antagonist starts to gain more leverage over the protagonist, and as a result, the stakes grow higher. This increase in leverage also results in the thing, or in my case, the facts and evidence the protagonist relies on falls through. Sometimes this outcome is due to things not appearing as they seem, or new evidence comes to light that discredits everything the protagonist knows up until now. In certain circumstances, the protagonist's support system is stripped away due to his actions. Quite often, decisions are made earlier in the story with very little understanding of the more significant problem at play, and as a result, these decisions come back and haunt him. You can see this scenario of decision making with very little knowledge at play in thrillers, especially in the conspiracy and action subgenres. Tip number 5, create a ticking time clock. Before I discuss the concept of a ticking time clock as a way of raising the stakes, I would like to point out that this isn't a must-have for the midpoint of your story. It's worth pointing out that a ticking time clock is a popular trope in the thriller genre. The great thing about a ticking time clock is it creates a hard deadline for your protagonist. This new time frame leads the reader to wonder if the protagonist can do X in Y number of days, and thus helps raise the stakes and makes things difficult for the protagonist and creates a page-turning effect. Just a quick recap, the 5 points you need to consider as you write a strong midpoint for your story are as follows. Include a reveal that affects the context of the story. The midpoint should create a personal shift for the protagonist. It should trigger a change in plans. The midpoint should strip away the protagonist's support system and create a ticking time clock. Are you struggling to write the midpoint of your novel? If so, read through your manuscript and consider which one of these tips could help you rewrite and create a more compelling midpoint for your story. After you make this change, come back over to the show notes for this podcast episode at ameliahay.com/midpoint. And let me know in the comments section which one of these tips you found most helpful. Happy writing, everybody! Thank you for listening to the Authorpreneur podcast. If you're new to this podcast or want to be notified about more episodes just like this, then click the subscribe button right now. I'm your host, Amelia Hay, and I'll see you next week for another episode.